I'm a mum of two. Blair is 6 and Rosie is 3. After Rosie had her 3rd birthday, I decided it was finally time to get back to work after taking time off to raise the kids. Time had gone very quickly, although I was finding it hard to get back into the swing of it at work. So, my husband and I agreed to do 2 opposite days a week in the office, 2 days at home, and then both in the office on a Friday, while Rosie was to attend a local daycare. Everything was going smoothly. We had a good routine. Until one Friday afternoon. My husband, Jim, and I were working. Blair was at school, and Rosie seemed to be enjoying her Friday daycare session. Then I received a phone call. But first, let me go back a little. We moved to this new neighborhood around 10 months ago. It was big, but quiet, and the houses were a decent space apart, with lots of yard space. This was very different from what we were living in before, but I really loved it there. Our house had 2 floors and a basement. The attic space was technically another floor, but we decided to just use it for storage. A few months after we moved in, we started noticing a few problems with the house. There were strange smells, which would seem to disappear by themselves. Things would go missing, then turn up in weird places, and food being taken from the fridge. I know what you're thinking. We have kids. These things happen with kids. But no. Even having kids, these things were strange. My toothbrush, ceramic plates, and even the cleaning supplies which were safely locked away would disappear almost daily, then return back to another room a few days later. One time I awoke in the middle of the night to what I thought was my husband getting up to use the toilet. Although, when my eyes adjusted, I saw him still laying next to me. This was strange, as I was sure someone was in the bathroom with the tap running. But after checking, no one was there, and the light and tap were now off. I asked him about this in the morning, but he confirmed he hadn't gotten up at the time I suggested. So, I just brushed it off. Strange things like this would happen frequently. Despite this, as I said, life was going smoothly until this Friday afternoon, when our lives started to turn upside down. Daycare was calling. I was at work in a meeting, but of course, my kids are more important, so I answered the call. And here's how it went. Hello? Good afternoon. Is this Zara, Rosie's mother? Hi. Yes, this is she. Is everything all right? Yes. No need to worry, Zara. Just a quick call to let you know that when you come to collect Rosie today, there will be an incident report to fill out. Oh, Alright. What's happened? Is she okay? Is everyone else? Sorry to scare you. Rosie is absolutely fine. Everything is okay. There was just something Rosie blurted out today. It's just nothing sinister or anything, just something she must have heard elsewhere. I won't repeat anything over the phone, but I will let you know when you come to collect her. We just had to complete an incident report, as it upset some of the other children. I could hear the panic in his voice. But my Rosie? This wasn't like her at all. She was so quiet. I picked Rosie up that day a little earlier than normal, and the daycare staff informed me she had mentioned something about a man living in her wardrobe who took her toys. I was gobsmacked. Where did this come from? I tried asking Rosie to explain to me what she was talking about, but she'd already forgotten. That evening I informed my husband Jim about what Rosie had said. He was equally confused, but seemed more scared. "You think this might have come from an experience?" he questioned. I hadn't thought about this before. God, maybe we fell victim to a burglary. I felt sick to my stomach. I initially thought this idea of a man in her wardrobe was something Blair had said, or something she'd seen on TV. But was there a possibility of this coming from an experience? Days turned into weeks, and with intense locking of doors, checking the house, and trying to talk to Rosie about this, we began to move on. 3-year-olds forget things quickly, and can say strange things at times, is what we had convinced ourselves. Until one evening, around winter break, Jim and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie. It was around 10:30 p.m, and the kids were both upstairs tucked into bed. It had been a long day, so Jim and I cuddled up and both began to drift off to sleep. Suddenly, I was knocked back into reality when footsteps were heard above us. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Jim. He mumbled back. "Must be Blair getting up for a pee." I waited. No, I thought to myself. It isn't Blair's room above us. It's our bedroom. I'm just going to check. I climbed the stairs, tiptoeing to not disturb anyone. But nothing. The kids were in bed. My room was untouched, and there was nothing unordinary. I choked it up to being sleep deprived, and decided to call it a night. The following day was a Sunday, and since Christmas was only a few weeks away, we agreed it was a perfect day to set up the Christmas tree. Jim and I headed up the narrow staircase to the attic, and instantly were faced with an awful smell. It smelt like sewage, and was sort of musty. I worried a pipe may have burst, and that was what I heard last night. But after investigation, it was all fine. We dusted off the Christmas tree and brought it down the stairs, one person at each end. I was on the upper end, and while I descended down the stairs, I noticed something in the corner of the attic. "Hold on a moment, darling," I said, dropping my end of the box. Okay." Jim struggled and lowered his end. I approached the area, which was in an alcove of the attic, with a ceiling height of about 4 feet. I hunched down. There were blankets, clothes, food wrappers, etc. Holy! I covered my mouth. "What's wrong?" Jim had managed to prop the tree up against the stairs, and was now behind me. "Look!" I exclaimed, feeling lost for words. My eyes began to water. "Previous owners?" I questioned. We looked at each other, agreeing. Something did feel off. But it was winter break. Family time was calling. So we cleaned it up and moved on to that instead. If only I had known. After completing the task of bringing the tree down the stairs, Jim and I went to collect the kids from their rooms to bring them down to help with the tree. Jim went for Blair, and I was to get Rosie. We assembled in the living room, unpacking our Christmas memorabilia, dusting off the last 12 months. Christmas films were playing. We danced to music and ate chocolate. It was the best family night for a while. As the kids started to wind down and began to get sleepy, Jim set off to retrieve pajamas from the girls' bedrooms. "Please don't let the man in my wardrobe tonight get me." Rosie looked up at me with her big brown eyes. "What? What man?" My heart began to pound. This hadn't been mentioned for quite some time. I didn't think we'd hear about it again. "I will protect you, sweetheart," I reassured her. It's all I could do in this situation. Blair began to get upset hearing about this man in the wardrobe situation which we managed to hide from her all this time, so I decided to change the subject to settle her. Jim returned, clutching 2 pairs of purple matching pajamas. We headed upstairs after a snack, and I updated Jim on Rosie, mentioning the thing again. "Must have been a dream she had," he stated, like he was reassuring himself. After tucking the girls into bed, I got halfway down the stairs when I heard a door opening upstairs. The girls had their own rooms, both in single beds, so they could easily leave whenever they needed something, which they did a lot. I rolled my eyes, knowing this was only the start of the bedtime pandemonium. "Blair, Rosie, come on girls, it's bedtime." I called up, waiting for the reply of a child who left their room. No reply. I went to Blair's room first, but she was out cold, snoring away. I waited to see if she was faking. While standing in the doorway, something caught my eye. The attic door was left open. This was strange, as it's child-proofed, and I'm sure I had closed it after taking down the decorations. I went over to close it, but as I did, there was a slight noise coming from Rosie's bedroom. Laughing, chatting, baby talk. There's the door opener culprit. Although, as I pushed the door open, it suddenly stopped. "Rosie, I'm coming in." But it was empty. Confused, I stepped inside, checking under the bed, behind the curtains, but no sign of her. I went over to check the wardrobe. "Come on, come out, Rosie. Are you in there?" I called out, getting annoyed now. "Yes, I'm in here, Mama." That wasn't Rosie. My blood ran cold as my expectation of hearing my daughter's voice was replaced by something unexpected. A man's voice, slightly high pitch. Unsure of what to do, I shouted for Jim. "Hey, babe, can you come here, please?" I felt my words begin to get muffled by tears. Rosie's just come down here, Zara. She said she walked past you while you were in Blair's room. What's going on? He replied, I'm just coming up. Speechless, relief flooded over me, knowing Rosie was safe. Relief was quickly replaced by a rush of adrenaline when I swung the wardrobe door open to reveal a dirty old man standing amongst my daughter's sparkly pink dresses. I screamed bloody murder. Before I knew it, Jim was grabbing my arm from behind and pulling me out of the room. Thankfully, he did this in time, as the man was lunging at me, holding one of our kitchen knives. The knife caught my forearm, leaving a gash, but I didn't feel the pain. We ran into Blair's room, scooping her out of bed. I heard the man climbing out of the wardrobe, knocking metal hangers out as he did. Jim and I loaded the kids in the car. The safest thing to do was just to leave. We sped off, driving for what felt like hours, before returning to meet the police outside our house. An ambulance came to check me out, but all I needed was a few stitches. It could have been a lot worse. Cops found the man, hunched in our basement laundry room, still clutching the bloody knife he used on me. They dragged him out in handcuffs, allowing me to get a better look. He was wearing my husband's clothes. His hair was matted, and he was thin as a stick. He looked ill and vacant, like he wasn't all there, or possibly on something. That day, while Jim and I were moving the Christmas tree, he managed to escape the attic while we were downstairs, not being heard due to the loud music. Rosie had left her bed that night due to being thirsty, and thank goodness she did, as I can only imagine what would have happened. Our missing items were found in his possession, and for 6 months he had been living above us, hiding among boxes, eating our food, using our facilities while we were away, stealing our things, and, worst of all, watching us sleep. I feel we are lucky in a way, as no one was seriously injured that night. I recovered well, and Jim and I were really shaken up, to say the least. We moved out of that house 3 months later, due to the horrific memories. We are safe now, and have installed a security system and camera in our new house. If only I had listened to Rosie weeks ago. I used to be one of those pageant mums. I know, pathetic, right? I used to get my self-worth from how prim and proper, and yes, pretty, others viewed my 6-year-old daughter, Lucy. It started as a hobby after the divorce, but soon became an obsession. Poor Lucy, being made to strut around, to perform on her tiny keyboard, wearing thick makeup more appropriate for a lounge singer. But I thought she enjoyed it, and it gave me something to post on social media. When Lucy took second in a local pageant, I got over 100 likes. It was the happiest day since my husband Dan had abandoned us. But I wanted more. After another disappointing performance, I started to fret. Nobody likes 4th place, and if they do, it's just to be polite. I could tell even my own mother was disappointed when Lucy failed to place at the counties. Just have to double down, I told Lucy. We just have to work harder. And we did. More vocal lessons, more piano practice, more expensive clothes and makeup, even though we were strapped since Dan left and my job paid peanuts. You simply need to be more, I told Lucy. More talented, more beautiful. The world is a competition, and you don't want to be left behind. It's better you learn that now, as a child. But the results only grew worse. Perhaps I put too much pressure on her. One night, after having been officially served with the divorce papers, a demon came to me. It spoke in my mind, but I knew it was pure and evil and real. It gave me one wish, but said to choose wisely. I knew I shouldn't have, but I was desperate, so I wished all the same. I wished that everyone in the town would recognize how beautiful Lucy was. A few days after that, she took ill. Some terrible infection that spread and spread, and that antibiotics couldn't cure. After a 3-day battle, Lucy was gone forever. Or so I thought. At her funeral, everyone from the town gathered around the tiny open casket and commented on how beautiful she was, just as I had wished. But that's where this story veers from tragedy to horror. It goes like this. Each night since Lucy was buried, I awake with a start, blurry eyes to the radio alarm clock, squinting until the red numbers come into focus. 3 in the morning, as always. I hear a light tapping along the sink in the bathroom across the hallway. So I clear the sleep from my eyes and sit upright in the creaky king-sized bed I used to share with my husband. By then, I can clearly make out the pitter-patter of little feet on tile, and given the familiarity of the noise, I forget for a moment that Lucy is gone. Next comes the sound of running water, then the croaking thump of the pipes as the old faucet is turned off. So I slip out of bed, sliding my ratty nightgown against the low-count sheets, feeling the horror of regret, as well as true repulsion and terror. In these moments, I feel as though I am being carried forward by some oblique yet indefinable momentum. Every night I wish it's a dream, or even a nightmare, but it never is. Just reality. Harsh, unblinking reality. As I near the bathroom, my nose is assaulted by the distinct smell of earth, as though Lucy had just come home from trundling through a local park. On I walk, to where the bathroom meets the hallway, moonlight snaking in through the foyer window and dancing like tiny zombies across the carpet. There is fresh dirt staining the carpet, a trail of breadcrumbs to where I must go. I will clean it up later, a mother's duty. Downstairs I can hear the front door ajar. heavy wind throttling it back and forth. I would like to lock the door, but I dare not resist my little Lucy. She's always had quite the temper. As I trudge forward, out of the corner of my eye, I see her empty bedroom, and all its empty pageant ribbons and trophies. More trophies than toys, I realize, bitterly. I walk on toward the pale iridescence sneaking out from under the bathroom door's piney frame, as though the door itself is a splintered coffin. I open the door at last, tasting metal in my throat, and a steady pulse rattle through my body, like electric current. Inside, it is always the same. Lucy, standing on her tippy toes, using the mirror above the sink to apply lipstick. She turns to face me, growing more decayed with each passing day. Mummy. She digs the lipstick at herself, claws at her tiny little face. I'm sorry I'm not pretty, she says. I'm so sorry, Mummy. Last night was the worst. The smell of a slaughterhouse. My daughter's face, colourless, with bits of dry patches forming where the skin has deteriorated away from the bone. Wearing that pageant red lipstick. Dressed in the gaudy pageant gown I had hand sewn for her just a few weeks back. Red as the lipstick, with black frills as accents. Lucy, I say, why are you here again? Because I live here, she says, tears soaking through mouldering eyes. Not anymore, I say. Because I'm not pretty anymore? She asks, and I feel both love and, yes, repulsion as I take her hand. I woke up in the lonely place and realized I must not look pretty. She had said that first night. When I first awoke, I thought I was ready for another pageant. My hair was curled, and I could taste makeup on my lips. But then I was alone. I knew I wasn't pretty. I knew I had to come home and get pretty. Appearances matter. Isn't that what you always say? I know then the horror of my wish, and all the moments leading up to it. I had tried to make a doll of my child, and now she was but a voodoo doll I could not be released from. I had made a horror of us both. It's cold and lonely there, Lucy said last night. Why do you keep returning me to the lonely place? Am I in time out? Is it because I didn't win? Is it because I'm not pretty enough? So, night after night, I walk her back to the cemetery, and I tuck her in, and then I trudge home, arms sore from the shoveling, and wait to do it all over. This new ritual of the macabre. But now I must go. I've been up later than usual, and I think I hear a scratching at the front door. It will soon be time to help Lucy with her makeup. Or at least, what's left of her. I was one of those pageant mums, and I suppose, in a way, I always will be. The people in this town aren't real. I don't mean that there's a bunch of mannequins all Nuketown style. I mean that they're just wrong. Everyone wears plain clothing. No brands, no words, not even pictures. Whenever they speak, it's only what needs to be said. Prices for groceries, gas, but rarely anything else. I once got bumped into while walking back to my apartment, but they didn't even say sorry or excuse me. Originally, I just brushed it off as them being an asshole, but the more I paid attention, the more things didn't seem right. I moved here 2 months ago due to a natural disaster in my town. My entire block was leveled and I decided that it was time for a change of scenery. About a week and a half after I moved here, however, the only bridge to exit this small island had collapsed. At first I didn't mind, because I didn't see any reason to go back to the big city. Now, I feel trapped. I've tried to talk to the people here from time to time, but I'm only ever met with curt responses or blank stares. I tried to ignore it because I assumed they didn't like non-locals. The people, however, were not the only thing off about the town. There were no emergency service buildings, bar a single hospital. There was only one grocery store and a handful of gas stations, even though there weren't even that many cars to begin with. After I decided to look closer, I noticed a couple of things. One day while I was getting groceries for the week, I decided to peek at what the person in front of me was buying. I've never been particularly nosy, but sometimes you just can't help yourself. What she had on the conveyor belt didn't make any sense. Bleach, cat litter, baking soda, shampoo, and one apple. At first glance, it just looked like anyone's normal groceries. But none of it coalesced. None of it belonged together without at least some other miscellanea to make it seem like you're actually shopping, and not just grabbing things to make the flow of life seem convincing. I would have almost brushed it off, if it wasn't for one thing. The apple was rotting. This would seem all the less strange if you would attempt to apply some logic to the situation. Maybe she couldn't find everything she was looking for. Maybe the produce section was just desolate today. But here's the thing. I've never seen a single shipment to the store. The shelves are always fully stocked every time I go in. There's not even anyone else in the store except the few customers and single cashier. There's no evidence that anyone has even bought anything except for the people waiting in line to check out. I only realized just how strange of a situation I was in when I saw how they acted when they thought they weren't being observed. In the rare circumstance that multiple people were at one singular stoplight, they were empty. All of their faces were completely vacant of all emotion or expression, as if it were just stamped onto an action figure. They all looked forward completely motionless, and I could swear not a single one of them blinked. Yet when the light turned green, all 5 cars moved in unison, without hesitation. Once again, at a glance, this looks like a completely normal action. Green means go, right? But when you stop to think, you would usually only start going once you see the person in front of you move. They did not. I've been doing a lot of stopping and thinking recently. I don't know when I decided to follow someone home, but I picked a random person and just kept behind them. They walked for hours, with seemingly no direction. A left here, a right over there, until the sun had fully sunken under the horizon, and they decided that it was time to go inside. Now, I don't mean that they walked home. That would be too simple. No. Instead, he just picked the closest house and went inside. I watched tentatively from the windows to see what he would do. Check the fridge? Watch TV? Maybe just sit on the couch and start reading a book. What he did was far more unsettling. He just walked into the bedroom, laid on the bed face up and fully flat, without even removing so much as his shoes and jacket, and closed his eyes. On the walk back to my house, I felt shaken. Everything about what I just witnessed was so wrong on an instinctual level that I couldn't stop my skin from crawling. When I finally reached my home, and inevitably my bed, I collapsed onto it, exhausted from hours of walking. Even though I was completely spent, I couldn't find sleep. I stared at my ceiling and walls for hours, just trying to pass out. But I couldn't. I started to feel just as unreal as the inhabitants of this alien island. Eventually, in the late hours of the AM, I passed out. I woke up to the sound of knocking at my door, which was terrifying for more than a couple of reasons. I cautiously opened the door to see a mailman with absolutely zero notable features. Without a word, he handed me a letter and left. When I opened it, there were only 4 words on the sheet of paper. They were very clear and housed an implicit threat. Mind your own business. Obviously, there was no return address. The next few days were notably different from the rest of the time I had spent here. Had I not spent the last several weeks heavily observing the population around me, I don't think I'd have noticed. People looked at me. They acknowledged my existence. I had never felt so naked before in my life. As time went on, it got worse. So much worse. This town full of people that just pretended to be alive had started to live around me, but only during the day. At night it was still so empty, you could mistake it for a model. I constantly would drive up to the collapsed bridge in hopes that it would magically be fixed, or at the very least, under construction. No such luck. I tried to pretend it was fine for so long, until eventually, one followed me home. He just stood outside the window, even after nightfall. Eventually he left, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of imminent danger. They all watch me now, waiting for something. So I've begun to blend in. I keep my face blank. I grab things at random when I go to the store. And at night, I make sure to get home as quickly and as inconspicuous as possible. No one looks anymore, but I can still feel their eyes burning behind me. I am trapped here, and they all know it. The following was recovered of a JVC GR SXM260U camera I found at a second-hand store. In the following, I have tried to recount the events captured on this camcorder. Entry 1. The footage begins by panning over an autumn valley. A woman's voice can be heard in the background. Beautiful, isn't it? A man responds, most likely the person holding the camera. Shut up, I'm trying to fill. His tone is jovial, and after a few seconds he adds, You're right though, it really is. The sun is setting. Entry 2. The woman is walking in front of the camera, following a trail leading through the forest. She is wearing a bright red windbreaker, beige cargo pants, a large backpack, and black hiking boots. The man behind the camera can be heard breathing hard. Wait up. The woman stops and turns her head to face the man. She smiles and begins walking towards him. You're too slow, she chuckles. Oh, fuck you, the man responds, both beginning to laugh. The woman reaches out her hand. Here, I'll hold that for you. The camera is handed over to the woman, and the man comes into view. He bends over, placing his hand on his knees. Oh, come on, look around you. Look at all of this beauty. I mean, don't you just get energized? What do you say we run the rest of the way, huh? The camera swings around as the woman is talking, capturing the woods around them. The trees differ in their vibrant hues of orange, yellow, and red. There is a shape moving among them, captured only for a brief moment. A dark brown hide and a hulking body. The man laughs. Entry 3. Darkness. To begin with, nothing of value can be made out of the video captured. Light shuffling and breathing can be heard. What is that? The woman whispers. It's probably just an animal. It must have gotten a scent of our food. It should be alright. Since we put it in a tree away from the tent, it shouldn't get too close. Something heavy can be heard circling the campsite. Aside from the sound of the animal and the man and woman breathing, it is deathly quiet. What if it's a bear? The woman's voice quivers. It'll be alright, honey. Sounds like it's moving away. The sounds of the animal lessen gradually, and after about 3 minutes, there is complete silence. Entry 4. The man is filming the campsite. Surrounding the couple's olive green tent are dozens of deep, wide tracks. The man puts his foot into one of the tracks. It is around 3 times larger than the man's boot. Big son of a bitch, the man mutters. This doesn't feel safe, Adam. What if it's still around here? The woman sounds upset. Yeah, let's pack up and get out of here. Entry 5. The man is filming down a valley. A light patter of rain can be heard. Walking through the valley is a grizzly bear, accompanied by 2 cubs. The camera zooms out, and we can see the woman standing with her arms crossed. She seems concerned. She frowns. The camera zooms back in on the bears. She must have been the one rummaging through our camp last night. Probably wanted to get her kid a quick snack. Suddenly, the 3 bears dash into the forest. Entry 6. It is dusk. We hear the couple walking. Further up the road in a clearing stands a log cabin. My grandpa built this cabin back in the 40s. It ain't much, but he built it all by himself. And I mean everything. He was the one cutting down the trees. He built the fireplace. It was pretty much all he left behind when he passed. Suddenly, all the nondescript noises of the forest die. Not one bird call, not one twig snapping. Nothing. The couple do not seem to take any notice. He must have been quite a man, your grandpa. The man sighs. Yep, all to wither down and die in the grand span of 3 months. I've never seen my dad like that. Bloodshot eyes, stooping shoulders. Fuck, it got to me. That was the worst part. They walk on in silence. Cancer's a bitch, she says. Cancer is a bitch. The couple walk for about 1.5 minutes in silence. The man films the ground. Suddenly, something charges the man. A grunt. He is struck either from the side or from the back. The camera falls to the ground. The woman shrieks. A high-pitched wail which pierces the veil of acidic silence, until her screams stop. There is thrashing and moaning. Another short scream, this time coming from the man. Then there is a wet squelching noise, and the man is silenced. We hear shuffling. Whatever attacked them is turning its attention to the woman now. She is crying. Light and defeated sobs are the only sounds that escape her. Then there is silence again. The attack lasts for around 4 minutes. Entry 7. A wooden floor. Light breathing. Then the mutter of a man. Shit. Entry 8. A man sits in front of the camera. His head is partially wrapped in white gauze, and his eyes are sunken. He is sitting in front of a dark wooden table. In front of him is a plastic bottle of water. It is half full. Behind him is a wall made of logs. Heavy rain patters against the roof of the cabin. Thunder can be heard in the distance. He sighs deeply. My name is Elliot Anderson. I am 49 years old. I am a resident of Bend, Oregon. At this particular moment, I'm in a forest in Wyoming. There is a storm brewing outside, and I am completely fucked. Although less fucked than I would have been if I hadn't found this cabin. The man stops and takes a swig from the water bottle in front of him. Anyway, I hope the owner doesn't mind me taking shelter in here. I lost my backpack somewhere along the way. There was so much rain and thunder, complete darkness. I fell and hit my head. It was bleeding when I got here, but I'm all patched up now. Lucky the owner had some medical emergency shit. Too bad he didn't stack up on some more water and canned beef. I'm hoping the storm blows over fast, so I can get the hell out of here. I'm signing off. Entry 9. The man is sitting in front of the camera again, his head in his hands. The water bottle has fallen over. It is empty. A kerosene lamp is burning. I figured out how to watch what's already been recorded on this thing. He pauses. Suddenly, thunder and lightning bears down onto the cabin. The man is illuminated. Waves of flooding rain crash against the walls, roof, and windows. Fuck. They were mauled. I can't get over the sounds. I've never heard someone scream like that, let alone cry like that. They must have invaded that bear's territory. It had cubs. They get crazy when someone closes in on their kids. Jesus Christ. There's a bear out there. Fuck. I'm all out of water, and there isn't shit to eat in here. I'm going to wait a while. I'm praying that it lets up. Otherwise, I'm going to have to brave the storm. He pauses again. If I don't make it out of here, I love you, Sarah, and I'm sorry things got all messed up. I'm an idiot, I know. I don't deserve you. But if I get through this, I'll never hurt you again. The man sobs, his voice breaking. I wish I could be with you, in our warm bed. I'm such an idiot. I love you, Sarah. I love you so, so much. Entry 10. I found them. It is the voice of Elliot. Not the couple, the bears. I tried to push through the storm. I was walking down the dirt road. Some of the trees have fallen down. The wind was as strong as 10 men. It felt like I was being pulled back toward the cabin by an invisible rope. I climbed over one of the fallen trees, blocking the road. And that is when I found them. All 3 of them. Massacred. They had been mangled. Something had snapped their bones like twigs. The cubs were nothing more than crushed piles of sliced meat and bloodied fur. Something had cut their stomachs open, their intestines spilling out of their bare chest cavities. A mother and her babies. The teeth in her mouth had been reduced to dust. Her entire snout had been crushed. I turned and ran right back to the cabin. Something has been pacing outside the walls. Something big. At first I thought it was another bear, a freak of nature. It would have to be able to do such a thing. But it isn't a bear. Because bears don't knock. Mikey, I'm not doing this. It's too dangerous, I said, stamping my foot in the thin layer of snow coating the frozen ground beneath us. Now quit being such a wuss. We'll be fine, he proclaimed, tugging my arm. No, Mikey, stop it, I wailed, collapsing to the ground dramatically. I knew he wouldn't keep trying to drag my dead weight. Fine. If you won't go with me, I'll just have to do it by myself. He released his grasp and shuffled to the ice. My heart pounded like a jackhammer in my tiny chest. Mikey, please. You're going to get hurt, I cried, tears beginning to blur my vision. Caleb, shut up. I'm trying to concentrate, he retorted, calculating each footfall with a precision that my 6-year-old mind couldn't comprehend. I held my breath, anxiously anticipating the tragedy that I feared would come. Mikey continued to scoot across the frozen lake, oblivious to the danger he was in. A few tense seconds later, and he'd reached the midway point. See, Caleb, you were being a big crybaby for nothing. Crack. A massive fracture erupted below Mikey's feet, spiderwebbing across the glassy surface on which he stood. My brother's face drained of colour as the consequence of his blunder crashed down on him like a ton of bricks. The ice groaned beneath his weight. Mikey didn't have much time. "Don't move. I'm going to get Grandpa," I said, praying that I would make it back in time. "Hurry, please." Mikey whimpered through clenched teeth, his hazel eyes pleading with me to keep my word. I turned to the house. It was only a few yards away. I could make it if I... Splash. The thin layer of ice separating Mikey and the frigid waters below gave way, plunging him into the wintry depths. "Help! Help!" he wailed, thrashing wildly as I sprinted to the house. I ran as fast as my little legs would carry me. By the time I made it inside, I was wheezing and sputtering nonsense. "Grandpa, Mikey, ice, fell, drowning," I cried, pointing out the window into the lake, where Mikey was visibly flailing his arms, desperate to escape his frozen prison. Grandpa instantly understood. He leapt from his armchair and bolted to the shed. He returned moments later with a long bundle of rope. He brushed past me, running quicker than I knew a man his age was capable. Once we reached Mikey, he was still floundering, struggling to keep his head above water.
"Mike, can you still feel your fingers?"
Grandpa shouted. His presence calmed my brother somewhat as his conclusive, erratic motions began to subside. Yeah, Mikey said, teeth chattering.
"Good. I need you to take this rope and tie it around yourself. I'm going to hoist you out."
Mikey nodded as Grandpa tossed the line into the freezing water next to him. Mikey hurriedly obeyed, fastening a knot around his torso.
"Hold on tight, boy."
Just as Grandpa was about to heave, Mikey suddenly disappeared into the murky depths. The line was being gulped into the water at a sickening rate. I turned to my grandfather. The look of fear rooted in his visage is one that I hope I never witness again. The rope continued to disappear until it went tight in Grandpa's grip. He braced for the impact and held firm as the mysterious force dragged him a few feet closer to the water. My heart palpitated furiously as he slid, dread seeping into my bones. Grandpa pulled, summoning every ounce of strength remaining in his weary muscles. Eventually, he began to make progress. Inch by inch, Grandpa was winning the battle. And then, all at once, the line went slack, and Grandpa fell flat on his arse. Something big burst from the hole, flopping onto the ice and sliding toward us. It was Mikey. His face was starting to turn blue, and he wasn't breathing. Grandpa reeled him in the rest of the way. He began CPR, laying my brother on the sturdy snow-covered ground and starting chest compressions. Blood thumped in my ears, and tears began streaming down my rosy cheeks. I was certain that Mikey was dead. A few dozen abdominal thrusts later, and Mikey coughed up water, returning to life as he frantically gasped for air. Gradually, the colour began to return to his face. I breathed a sigh of relief and threw my arms around his soaking body. "Don't you ever do that again. I thought you died. I sobbed, clutching him in a vice grip. He didn't return my embrace. Mikey? What I saw once I pulled away chilled me to my core. My brother sat motionless, staring at me with wide, vacant eyes. He didn't so much as twitch from the cold. His dead, emotionless face sent panic rippling through me. What's wrong with him, Grandpa?
I don't know,
he said as he scooped Mikey into a fireman's carry.
But we need to get him out of the elements. Once we get inside, I need you to dial 911, okay?
I nodded, diligently following behind him. The paramedics arrived shortly after I called. They treated Mikey for mild hypothermia on the way to the hospital. They needed to take him in to make sure his stint under the water hadn't done any permanent damage to his brain. I was a bundle of nerves the whole way to the emergency room. Grandpa had gone with Mikey in the ambulance, so I rode with Grandma to meet them. She reassured me the best she knew how, but it did little good. My mind was a jumbled mess of thoughts and emotions. Why didn't he just listen to me? What was he thinking? What pulled him under for so long? And the one that really stuck with me. Was this my fault? I should have tried harder to stop him. Guilt gnawed at me like piranhas devouring a slab of meat. I wasn't really to blame. Was I? I tried to cram the notion to the furthest compartment of my brain as we pulled into the parking lot. We signed in at the front desk, and a few painstaking minutes later, we were reunited with Mikey and Grandpa. Mikey gazed at nothing in particular, his glassy eyes staring at the empty, cream-colored wall. I tentatively approached him. I slowly reached toward him, terror stabbing through my chest like a butcher knife. Sweat pooled above my brow as my fingertips grazed his arm. Mikey suddenly snapped toward me, snatching my wrist with an intensity that no 9-year-old should possess. I froze in shock. Mikey's grip was ice cold, searing my skin with his touch. And those eyes, his pupils bore straight into mine. The loathing hatred behind them sent chills undulating down my spine. I was stuck there. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even look to my grandparents for help. The world melted away, leaving the two of us alone in a nauseating staring match.
Caleb.
I was pulled back to reality by Grandpa's worried voice. He lightly shook my shoulders. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Grandpa.
I need you to scoot over, buddy. Dr. Kent here needs to run some tests on Mikey.
I obliged, joining Grandma. I glanced at Mikey, failing to meet his gaze. He'd returned to fixating on nothing, staring straight ahead at the featureless nondescript wall. After sufficiently poking and prodding my brother, the doctor returned to us.
His physical reactions seem normal enough. However, it does concern me that he isn't speaking or responding to stimuli. There may be some permanent damage, but we'll need to do a CAT scan to be sure.
My grandparents grimly locked eyes. Grandpa nodded to Dr. Kent.
Okay, do it.
Mikey had to stay in the ER until the early hours of the morning. All the while, he didn't utter so much as a cough. The medical staff performed a myriad of tests on him, which seemingly all reached the same conclusion. My brother was fine. Finding nothing out of the ordinary, Mikey was discharged. Dr. Kent instructed Grandpa to take him to a personal physician if the odd behavior continued, and explained that there was nothing else he could do. We thanked him and we left, tired and frustrated by the lack of results. We finally arrived home at 4 in the morning, nodding off and ready for some much-needed rest. Well, everyone except for Mikey. That same fish-eyed expression was pasted on his face. I shuddered just looking at him. I was almost disappointed when the doctors didn't find anything. If they had, at least we'd know why Mikey was acting this way. Instead, we were left with no explanation, no signs of improvement, and no answers. I passed out the moment my head hit the pillow. My sleep-addled brain had been working in overdrive for the entire evening, and I was pooped. Grandma tucked me in, wishing me sweet dreams. As the door creaked shut, and my vision faded to black, Mikey faced the wall opposite me in the fetal position. The thought that he might actually be getting some much-needed sleep comforted me, and I was lulled into a peaceful slumber. I awoke with a start in the middle of the night. My heart was racing and my pajamas were drenched in sweat. My eyes frantically darted from side to side as they adjusted to the darkness. I attempted to lift my arm, but I was frozen. I couldn't move a muscle. I panicked. I tried to kick, to flail, to scream, anything. But it was all futile. There was no doubt about it. I had sleep paralysis. Just when I was thinking that I should shut my eyes and try to nod off, I heard it. A shuffling noise from across the room. My blood turned to ice, and I slowed my breathing, listening intently. I waited, my mind running wild with possibilities. And then I heard it again. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. Tears welled in the corners of my eyes as terror surged through me. Slowly, a shape began to emerge in my field of vision. A humanoid shape. Mikey's face gradually slid into view. He hovered inches above me, his wide, unblinking eyes staring hungrily at my motionless form. I could feel his hot, musty breath wafting into my nostrils as I staved off the urge to vomit. He stayed there for what felt like ages, immobile and unwavering. Those cold, dead eyes boring into my psyche and rooting themselves in my nightmares. Out of nowhere, Mikey began to lean in closer until he was directly next to my ear. What he whispered still gives me chills to this day. Please, help me. It wants my soul. Mikey then disappeared from view and scuttled back to his bed. My heart pounded so hard that I thought it was liable to leap from my chest at any given moment. What the hell was that? I lay in silent hysteria as my still developing brain struggled to comprehend what I had just seen. Somehow, I calmed myself enough to return to a fitful slumber. I awoke that morning, hyperventilating. I think something has taken hold of Mikey, and I'm afraid that it wants to take me next.
We made a huge mistake. We just thought it would be a fun idea, I promise. Me and my roommate Nolan, we like collecting random, weird stuff. Nolan likes thrifting and dumpster diving. I like building stuff in the garage, or collecting weird trinkets. If you had asked me a week ago what the worst thing we'd ever found when looking through the garbage was, I would have told you that it was a bag of dog shit. That was until we found these things. It was a few days ago, and me and Nolan were cruising through some local alleys in my car, looking for treasure. We had found a few small things, some cool old plates, a busted painting, a nice wooden side table, a good haul, more or less. We were driving behind a strip mall, passing some dumpsters, when Nolan grabbed me by the shoulder. "Dude, look," he said, pointing to a dumpster just ahead of us, where a set of white feet were poking up from the top. I immediately pulled the car over and parked it in front of the dumpster. We got out, hopped up on the ledge of the dumpster, and peered inside. Mannequins. Sick. I grinned. "Think we can fit them?" Nolan asked, looking at me. "We'll make 'em fit. Here, you fish them out. I'll go make space," I said, as I stepped down and popped the trunk of my car. I moved a few things we had found so far into the trunk, and pointed out that the mannequins could be stacked horizontally in the back seat. There were 3 of them. Definitely not brand new, but not too bad for a dumpster find. A few scuffs and scratches here and there, but it wouldn't be a problem. This was a good enough find to make us return home satisfied with our catch, which we did. We unloaded and stacked everything in the garage, and brushed off our new treasure, the mannequins. "What should we do with them?" Nolan asked. We both pondered for a moment. "You know what would be hilarious?" I started. "What if we put speakers in them, and made them say creepy shit to scare people?" "That's genius." Nolan smiled, nodding his head. We spent the next hour or two cutting holes in the back of the mannequins' heads, and taping some small Bluetooth speakers into them. We found an app that would let us broadcast our voices from our phones directly to the speakers. So we spent the rest of the afternoon playing around with that, until we got bored. We sent a few pictures and videos of them to our friends, who all thought that we were crazy. Our other 2 roommates weren't thrilled at the idea of the weird speaking mannequins being part of the household, but we waved them off and told them that they'd get used to it. I wish we'd listened to them. It was the next morning. As I was having a cup of coffee and browsing Instagram at the kitchen table, that Nolan came into the kitchen, laughing as soon as he saw me. "You got me good with that one last night," he said. "Huh?" "The mannequin you put outside my bedroom door. Real spooky." "It wasn't me," I said. "It must have been Amy or Sunny.
our other roommates.
Yeah, sure, whatever. I'm gonna get you back though. Just you wait.
Nolan said with a dismissive wave of his hand, as he took a cup of coffee for himself and went back upstairs. That day passed as any Saturday would, mostly doing nothing, a bit of cleaning around the house. Later in the evening, we invited a couple of friends over, so that we could crack open a few beers and have a fire in the backyard. We showed off our mannequins, and everyone hated them, except for me and Nolan. We didn't really care though. We decided to put them back inside so that they wouldn't bother people too much. Going to the bathroom. Anyone need anything? I asked, standing up from the fire. 1 or 2 people wanted beers, so I nodded and went inside. The bathroom door was slightly ajar and the lights were off, so I figured nobody was in there. I pushed the bathroom door open and gasped, jumping back suddenly as I saw one of the mannequins standing in the middle of the bathroom.
"Boo,"
came a voice from the speaker in its head. "Oh, fuck off," I said, as my fright turned into laughter. I picked up the mannequin and carried it into the living room.
Put me down,
the mannequin cried as I carried it.
"Unhand me, Rylan."
Shut it, Nolan, I said as I propped the mannequin in the corner of the living room. I went back outside with the requested beers and flipped Nolan off as I stepped down the deck stairs. He laughed and waved me off. We spent the rest of the night drinking and laughing. The fire was turning into coals, and most of our friends had left by about 2 in the morning. I finished my final beer and told everyone good night as I chucked the can on our pile of empties. I stumbled back inside and pushed my bedroom door open. I was too drunk to be scared this time, so I merely chuckled to see all 3 mannequins lined up on the far side of my bed. One of them had its arm extended, the hand gesturing to the bed.
"Sleepy time,"
said one of the mannequins. I sighed and moved them all back out to the living room, wondering if rescuing these things was going to be more of a hassle than it was worth. I went back to my room and closed my door and crawled into bed, falling asleep to the peaceful hum of the air conditioning. I woke up late and rolled over to check my phone. I scrolled through a few Instagram notifications and checked the news on Reddit, and then almost had a heart attack when I got out of my bed to make my way to the bathroom.
"Rise and shine,"
said the mannequin standing at the foot of my bed. The faces of the mannequins we had found were the blank, smooth kind, without detailing. But Nolan had evidently drawn a smiley face in Sharpie on this one. I reached over to my nightstand and angrily threw a copy of Game of Thrones at the mannequin, which hit it square in the chest and sent it toppling over backwards to the ground.
"Ouchie,"
it said from the floor. I threw on a bathrobe and left the room. I showered and generally went about my Sunday. When I returned to my room to get dressed, the stupid mannequin was still sprawled out on the floor, with the stupid smile on its face. I grabbed it by the arm and dragged it to the living room, where I propped it up with the other mannequins, which now also had smiley faces drawn on their blank smooth heads. Sonny worked late that day, and Nolan and Amy were out doing something, so I had the house to myself. After I spent most of the day reading and playing some video games, I decided I would finish off the last few beers left in the case from yesterday. I grabbed one out of the fridge, took a cigarette from my pack, and stepped out onto the back deck.
"Okay, fuck these things," I said, as I saw the 3 mannequins were stood in a circle around the fire pit in the backyard, holding empty beer cans in their hands. I set my beer down, walked back inside, and picked up the baseball bat I kept next to my bed. I walked back outside, lit my cigarette, and proceeded to knock the head of the closest mannequin clean off, the white head sailing across the backyard. "Home run," said one of the mannequins behind me, after which I immediately turned and slashed it across the torso with the bat. I laid into the mannequins, caving in the chests, knocking the heads off, and bashing the limbs apart. I picked up the remnants of the mannequins and carried them into the alley, where I dropped it all next to the garbage. "From garbage you came, and to garbage you shall return," I said to the mannequin parts, and flicked my cigarette onto the pile. How the fuck did L.Lind do that? I said to myself as I walked back into the backyard. I smoked another cigarette on the deck, chugged my beer, grabbed another, and went back to my computer to play some more games. About an hour elapsed when the nicotine started to call to me again, and I went back to the deck for another cigarette. I couldn't tell if I wanted to cry, scream, run, or rage as I stepped outside and saw all 3 mannequins standing around the fire pit again. Their heads were all turned to face me, and where before they had smiley faces, all 3 now had frowning faces drawn on in Sharpie. The worst part was, they all had duct tape wrapped around themselves, reattaching arms, heads, patching holes and holding them together where I had smashed them apart. I stood in stunned silence, blinking, pinching myself, hoping I was dreaming for a good minute. I felt afraid to even take my eyes off these stupid things. So, staring straight at them, I put the cigarette to my lips and lit it, puffing out the initial cloud of smoke. "Ouchie," said one of the mannequins, breaking our staring contest. I immediately strode down the stairs, yanking the garage door open and grabbing the jerry can of gasoline that I kept for my lawnmower. I went back into the yard, snapped each of the mannequins in half, threw them in the fire pit, doused them all in gas, and threw my cigarette onto the pile. The entire thing went up in a great rush of smoke, and the heat flashed against me so suddenly I stumbled back from the fire pit. I angrily flipped off the burning pile and sat on one of our 4 deck chairs, silently, angrily watching the fire burn. I knew on the inside that L.Lind was probably watching me from somewhere in secret, laughing his ass off at my reaction to these stupid dumpster mannequins. But I didn't care. I hated them at this point, and I didn't give a shit if I looked like an idiot. Once the fire had burned itself out, all that was left were a few charred pieces that evidently weren't made of anything meltable, and a pile of molten, black something. Plastic, maybe? I don't know what they make these mannequins out of. I angrily made my way back inside the house, heading for my office. I was walking by the living room when I heard it. Hot. I stopped dead, too afraid to look. I slowly turned my head, and in the darkness of the living room, I saw 3
still, humanoid shapes. They were charred black, with wisps of smoke rising off of them to the ceiling. I felt my legs go weak, and my heart start racing. I ran back to the bedroom and slammed the door. I threw everything on top of my dresser to the floor and pitched the whole thing on its side against my door. I sat down on the floor of my room and started to record this. Please, someone, please just tell me how he managed to do it. I know that mannequins can't come to life. It's impossible. I know it is. But how did L.Lind do it? Why did he do it? Why? I keep yelling through the door, begging, pleading, just wanting to know how he did it. They're not real. It's a joke. It has to be a joke. Please, you guys are the ones who know about the supernatural, creepy things. I need to know what's happening. I need to know that this isn't real. I'm dreaming, hallucinating. It has to be that. But I've never had a dream like this before. They're right outside the door. I know it. Because all they're saying now, over and over, is sleepy time. Please, somebody help me. The surface of the moon was a dull, dusty grey, but the view from the lander window was still the most beautiful thing I had seen in my life. The earth shone brightly in the distance on a canvas of pure black, surrounded by legions of stars. I and my 4 other crewmates had just landed on the moon's surface a few hours ago, cementing ourselves in the history books alongside only 12 others who had witnessed the same majesty in person.
Crazy, isn't it?
A voice asked from beside me. I turned, knowing well the voice of the man whom I had worked closely with for the past 2 years in preparation for this mission. It was Andrew Ratcliffe, the crew's geological specialist. I can hardly believe it, I said breathlessly. I'm looking at it with my own eyes, and even still I can't believe we're here. Decades of staring up here, wondering what it will look like will do that. Another voice chimed in, this one belonging to Diana Figueroa, our mechanical engineer. Doesn't seem real. The 2 other members of the crew, Noah Thornton, our medical specialist, and Amelia Shah, our commander and pilot, were still working on donning their spacesuits, but I was certain they shared the same sentiment. With all the post-landing checks complete, the crew was preparing to set off on the first lunar exploration since 1972. The commander had asked me to stay behind and follow protocol of having 1 person in the lunar lander at all times. I'd reluctantly agreed. Having secured her helmet, I heard Commander Shah's voice come in from one of the speakers on the control panel in front of me. Testing comms. Test, test. Can you hear me? I nodded and gave her a thumbs up. The others responded with their confirmation, each voice coming through the radio on the panel, clear as a bell. I pressed the mic button and spoke. Loud and clear. Can you hear me? Again, they all responded in the affirmative. For this first outing, it only seems fitting that we visit Taurus Litro and pay our respects to the flag erected by our predecessors," Commander Shah said through her radio. "The valley isn't far, especially if we take the rover. So, overall, I think we can plan on a modest 3-hour tour. Agreed?" Everyone agreed. "We've got enough oxygen for an 8-hour expedition, so there shouldn't be any concern there. If we run into trouble, Bellamy will manage comms and visuals fed in from the rover, and will be able to assist us from the lander." "Just don't be gone for too long," I said. "I can't wait to get out there, and it's going to kill me to watch you all having fun." "Don't worry, Cinderella," Noah said. "You'll get to the ball." "Yeah, Noah knows all about getting to balls," Drew quipped, earning himself a stern response from Commander Shah, although I thought I could see a faint smile on her face through the reflective glass of her helmet. We said our goodbyes, and I watched from the window as my 4 crewmates piled into the LRV and drove off into the distance. The LRV was equipped with several cameras, all of which ran a constant feed into a series of monitors at the control panel. With that, and with the radio communication, it was almost like I was there with them. I wasn't suited up myself, sure, but it was just enough to satiate the excitement I'd felt growing in my stomach from the moment we'd left Earth. I watched as the crew approached the valley, where the last lunar crew had planted their flag in 1972. Our crew assembled and planted their own. My heart broke a little as I watched this all take place, wishing desperately that I could have been there. But I knew that someone would have to stay back had I gone, and I wanted that for my colleagues, my friends, as little as I wanted it for myself. It was enough just to be where I was. After about 2 hours had passed, Commander Shah started to shut down the party. "All right, everyone, finish collecting your samples and taking measurements, and let's get back to the lander. We promised Bellamy that we'd..." Her voice trailed off. "Did any of you just see that?" Normally I would have expected a poorly timed joke from Drew or Noah, but the sudden sharp tone in the commander's voice was so off-putting that I knew at once something was wrong. "Noah?" Commander Shah said in a tone I liked less than her first question. Was that concern in her voice? "What's going on?" I asked into the mic. Silence answered. "Commander, do you copy?" Nothing. I looked over at the video feed and saw someone, I couldn't distinguish who, walking past one of the cameras. Then every single feed went black. "Guys, what's going on?" I asked urgently. "Amelia, Noah, Diana, Drew, can any of you hear me?" Silence. "I've lost comms and visuals. Repeat, I have lost comms and visuals. I'm totally blind over here. If you can hear me, return to the lander at once." Nothing. On the screens in front of me, white text flashed, reading, "Signal lost." The silence I was then plunged into was so total, so isolating, that it sucked the air from my lungs and threatened to suffocate me. For a moment, I teetered on the edge of insanity, and then it was gone. I sprang into action, immediately running troubleshooting processes and reboot protocols. If both the signal from the rover and the comms were down, that was more likely to be an issue with the lander than it was with the team. And if it was an issue with the lander, it was something I could fix. I spent the next hour running diagnostics and trying everything to get comms back, all while repeating my message into the mic, hoping that the team would return sooner than planned. As their arrival time approached, I found myself looking out the window several times a minute, anxious for my comrades to return and assist me with this growing catastrophe. The next hour passed with terrifying speed, as I spent more and more time staring at the horizon, praying desperately to see movement. Still, nothing happened. Nobody came. Nothing moved. Where the hell were they? Being late was unlike Amelia. Being an hour late was downright impossible, unless something happened to them. I took a deep breath. Nothing happened to them. What could possibly happen? They were the smartest people I'd ever known. The likelihood of them getting into trouble was impossible, unless there was something outside of their control. And there were very few things outside of their control. I ran through the reboot protocols again for the communication systems, not expecting anything to work, but wanting something to help pass the time. Another hour passed, and still no communication from the team, and no sign of anything along the horizon. I did everything I could to focus on the problem with the comms, instead of trying to speculate why they were so late. There was very little I could do until I either made contact with them, or they came back to the lander. Eventually I came to the conclusion that the only way the signal to the lander could be down was if there was some physical damage to the antenna, because not only was I unable to receive messages from the crew, I also couldn't make contact with NASA or the ISS. In order to fix that, I would have to climb to the top of the lander and investigate it for myself. I donned my suit, feeling only a twinge of excitement as I did so, because while I was about to fulfill a lifelong dream, it was not remotely lost on me how utterly desperate my situation was fast becoming. When I stepped outside the lander, I was, for a moment, 12 years old again, lying on the grass in my backyard, listening to the crickets chirp and staring up at the big white rock in the sky, promising myself that I would touch that rock one day. It was a perfect moment, one of the very few each of us are allotted in a lifetime, and just as quickly as it came, it was over, and I was climbing up the ladder to inspect the antenna at the top of the lander. Had I been further away, I would have been able to easily see that the antenna was broken, but because I hadn't stepped far enough away from the lander, I didn't make that discovery until I was nearly at the top. The antenna and dish were misshapen and bent, and upon closer inspection, I saw a series of small cracks and scratches around some of the narrower parts. Had I not known better, I would have guessed it had somehow been damaged during landing. However, that was impossible, because the antenna hadn't fully deployed until after we were safely on the moon's surface. I did what I could, which was admittedly little, considering the state of disrepair the antenna was in, and returned to the lander. I was able to get a few garbled sound bites, which was better than what I had been getting, but nothing that I could count as distinguishable communication. I was just about to take my suit off when I heard it. Coming through the radio in my helmet was the faint, staticky voice of Commander Shah. I felt stupid for not thinking about it, but didn't chide myself too badly, because given the distance the crew was from the lander, it likely wouldn't have worked until now anyway. But the suits were all outfitted with their own radio networks, so they could communicate with one another without having to bounce signals off of the lander. I nearly screamed in delight and relief when I heard her voice. "Dill, inside. Repeat. Amelia, I can hear you, but the signal is bad. Where are you?" "Inside. Bellamy." "Amelia, what's your location? I'll come get you." "No. I'm coming. Inside. Stay inside." Her voice was coming over more clearly now. "I'm inside the lander," I said. "Good. Do not enter the... I can almost read you," I said. "Try again." "Do not let anyone enter the lander." I frowned. I heard what she'd said, but that didn't make sense. "Do not let anyone in the lander? Why?" I looked outside the window then, and far off in the distance, I could make out a shape, presumably Amelia, hurrying toward the lander. Her voice was clearly out of breath when she spoke again. "You cannot let anyone inside. The team is contaminated. Unless we can purge the contaminant, nobody can enter the lander." I looked at the clock and did some quick math. "Amelia, where are the others? There's no way any of you have much oxygen left. 10 minutes, maybe 15 or 20, max. I can come out and bring you..." "No," she said sternly. "Do not come out here. The others are coming, but I think they've all been exposed." "Exposed to what?" "Something got into Noah's suit," the commander said, breathing heavily now. I saw it in his face mask, back in the valley." "Something got into his mask?" I asked, struggling to believe what she was telling me. "Are you talking about an extraterrestrial life form?" "I don't know," she said. By this point, she had stopped a few yards away from the lander and took a moment to catch her breath. "Maybe. Probably. That's the only explanation I can think of. I saw it moving around in Noah's mask. Then I thought I felt something in my suit too. I tried to get it off. I could feel these little pins and needles moving around my body, like the tiny needlepoint legs of an insect. I panicked and stumbled into a crater. Smashed myself up pretty good and blacked out for a second, I think. When I came to, I noticed a small tear in my suit. I patched it up with tape, but I can't be sure if the tear was there before or after I fell into the crater. I think that's how whatever it is got in. But..." The commander was cut off by other voices then, choppy and indiscernible at first, but soon I could confirm them to be the other 3 members of the crew. "Thank God," I said into the mic. "I'm picking up your signals now. Diana, Drew, Noah, I read you." "Bellamy, listen," the crew commander said desperately. but Diana's voice cut her off. We lost communication. Then the commander fell down into the crater. We think she may be concussed, because when she came around, she was experiencing disorientation and paranoia. I looked down at the camera that was positioned toward the front of the lander, where Commander Shah was now sitting. She stared up at the camera and shook her head slowly. We need to get her inside so we can take a look at her, Noah said. Open the airlock and we'll get her taken care of. She said you'd been contaminated, I said, feeling my pulse quicken with every passing moment. This was not the time to mince words, because if I didn't let them in soon, my colleagues would suffocate. How were you contaminated? She's confused, Drew said. There's nothing but rocks and dust up here. There's nothing here to contaminate us. She said she saw something in Noah's suit. I pressed. Bellamy, the commander said, grasping now with every word she spoke. Listen to me. I stared at the monitor, feeling the weight of the decision before me pressing down into my chest. At the rate Amelia was gasping for air, she had minutes left at best. She had probably used more oxygen to rush to the lander before the others, but even still, I doubted they were far behind her. Where's the rover? I asked, voicing one of several questions that were rapidly firing into my brain. Why didn't you drive it here? Noah and Amelia answered at the same time. Noah's explanation had been that the rover lost power. Amelia's had been a single word: escape. The others had reached the lander now, and were banging on the side of the airlock. Bellamy, open this door, they yelled desperately. I need to understand the contaminant, I pressed. Noah, what was in your suit? Nothing was in his suit. Andrew fired back angrily. She's sick, and if you don't let us in, she's going to die. Amelia was now on her side, and I could hear a rattle in her throat with every labored breath and word she spoke. This is Amelia Shah. Final transmission. Over the commander's final words, the crew continued banging on the side of the lander, screaming at me to let them in so they could save her. God damn it, Bellamy. Open this door. My stomach twisted in knots with the decision I was faced with. To save the lives of my fellow crewmates and risk contamination of myself, and possibly of Earth, or to keep them locked out and let them die of asphyxiation, kill them all and save my own life, or save them all now and condemn myself along with them. I nearly did it. I nearly opened the airlock to let them in. I nearly saved Amelia's life and, in doing so, killed us all. What stopped me was a realization I hadn't come to until I'd given myself a moment to think. The airlock could be opened from the outside. Of course it could. I'd done it myself just a short time ago. So why weren't they opening it for themselves? And why was Amelia the only one gasping for breath? My decision was made. The airlock would remain closed, and I would condemn my friends to death. The minutes fell away like the tears on my cheeks as I mourned the loss of my dear friend and commander while the sounds of fists beat against the side of the lander. This carried on for an hour or so, maybe longer, and still none of them gasped for breath, even once. I was able to get a signal out, at least enough to share my story, along with a repeating SOS signal. But the reception still doesn't seem to work, so there's no way of knowing if this transmission even made it back to Earth. I went on about cycling through the reboot protocols again, something I hadn't done since I'd repaired the antenna. I hadn't expected any other results though. It was simply something to do to keep my mind occupied away from the incessant sound of the banging at the door. So, I was surprised when I picked up a series of grainy images of the video feed from the rover. The images weren't great, given the poor signal, but I was able to make out all the detail I needed. The bodies of Diana Figueroa, Andrew Ratcliffe, and Noah Thornton. Diana was draped over the front seat of the rover. Andrew was leaning against a rock about 10 yards away, the glass of his helmet smashed. And Noah was lying face down in the dust, half of his body hanging over the edge of a crater. In the distance, I could just barely make out another trio of what looked like bodies that bore a striking resemblance to the spacesuits worn by the last men that had walked across the same ground just over 50 years ago. Men that I had read about, seen videos of, idolized. Perhaps one of whom had heeded the calls of his other crewmates and opened the door.
I was always a solitary kid growing up. I grew up on the outskirts of a little town and never really had any friends. I would hang out with someone here and there, but for the most part, I stuck to myself, even in high school. Because of my voluntary solitude, I found time to invest in hobbies like fishing, hunting, and playing cards. I used to always love a game of spades with my parents and little brother. Though I loved all the hobbies I partook in, hunting was by far and away my favorite. I would hunt all sorts of critters when it was in season, and spent hours just to hunt something. See, the fun part of it wasn't the fact that I just liked to kill something. It was the fact that I had outsmarted the animal and beaten it. I now had a trophy to signify my victory, and I thirsted for this sense of victory. Nothing even came close to the euphoria supplied to my brain when I came home with a fresh kill under my belt. I would sometimes spend days out in the wilderness to hunt, and I'd get lost out there, out in the nature, with nothing but the sounds of the other creatures that inhabited the woods in which I was choosing to steal life away from. Due to my love for hunting and fishing, I never found time to do much schoolwork. I passed all my classes with at least a C and graduated high school, but further education was not something destined for me. I was convinced hunting was my calling. After high school, I began to hunt not just for pleasure, but for work too. There was a company close by to my hometown that made deer jerky, and was looking for hunters that could deliver them the meat. Of course, me, the self-proclaimed lover of such activities, applied for this position, and after a week of waiting, got the job. I was to begin as of right then and there. So, I grabbed my gear and went out to the woods. I set up shop in the tree stand I had been using for as long as I can remember, and began to wait. I must have sat in that stand for hours, because soon the sun was beginning to set. It was summer though, so I knew I had some time before I was shrouded in darkness. That's when I saw him. A male buck pranced into view all the way on the horizon. I sat there watching it, mesmerized by how it moved. It calmly paced the forest floor, bending over here and there to eat some grass or berries, until finally it came to the creek that I had set my stand up near to. It stood for a moment, looked around, and dropped its head to take a much-needed sip of water. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I raised my rifle, knowing I only had one shot, and aimed it directly behind his front shoulder. I took a deep breath. My shot was perfect. It traveled directly through the buck's heart and killed him on the spot. My heart swelled as again I knew I'd won. All this waiting was not in vain. I nearly flew down the steps to my stand and rushed over to the buck. His eyes were still open. I was glad it was instant, so that he wouldn't have to suffer. I picked him up, and soon I was back home. I called the company, and soon they had someone come over to my house and pick up my latest kill. I thanked the man as he left, and shut my door, feeling prouder than ever. I knew that this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life. A few years passed, and I continued doing what I loved, and eventually I received enough money from hunting that I moved away from my hometown and moved to West Virginia, as I heard that the hunting there was great. I wanted to live out in the back country, as I wanted to be able to hunt all the time, and I found a place where I could do just that. There was an old cabin, not too expensive, that sat right in the woods, not too far away from a town, maybe 15 or 20-minute drive, so not completely isolated. But the town it's close to is not exactly bustling, so it's not urban either. I liked it very much, and even made a couple of friends in town. Most liked hunting, but only one ever wanted to come out with me to hunt. His name is Brian. Brian's a good guy, and a young one too. He's just about my age, give or take a few years older, but we get along well, and we've gone hunting multiple times. The only difference between us is that he's got a full family. Wife, kids, the works. Even has a golden retriever. He's a lucky guy, I'll tell you what. A good shot too. I'm glad he's my partner. I had set up my tree stand maybe a week after buying a cabin out in the woods, and maybe a month after that is when Brian and I first went hunting together. We sat up in that stand for hours, waiting for something to turn up. Eventually a doe showed up, and we did our thing and carried her back to my cabin. At this point, I had learned enough about the making of jerky to know how to do it myself, and with the help of Brian, we skinned the doe and began making jerky and venison steaks. That was a good night. We would go hunting maybe once or twice every 2 weeks, but I would go hunting almost every night. At this point, I had found another company somewhat close by, maybe an hour away, that again needed hunters to gather meat and send it to them. So once again, I applied and got the job. Everything seemed to be going well. I was good at my job, and it paid well. Because I was up in that tree stand for so long, almost every night, I knew just about every sound in the woods, from the elk yells to mountain lion screams to foxes and coyotes. You give me a noise out in those woods, and I could tell you exactly what animal it was, and even sometimes which gender it was. That's what made this certain night so different. Like usual, I was up in my stand, and I heard a scream. I played it off like it was nothing, because it probably was nothing. Except, this scream was different. It sounded similar to something I've heard before, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Brian was with me, and he couldn't figure it out either. Usually we don't really care about these noises, as it's not exactly our business to worry about every little sound we hear in the woods at night. However, this noise was just wrong. Something was not right with this scream, and after a good 10 minutes of sitting through it and thinking every animal it could be, Brian and I decided that we would go check it out. After all, we were armed and both good shots. And if it was a mountain lion, we figured it would turn and run away if it heard us coming. We got down from the stand and began our walk towards the direction of the scream. After a minute or two, we could tell we were getting closer because the noise was getting louder. It seemed almost echoing through the trees, and I won't lie when I say it freaked us both out a little. However, we trudged onward, and eventually, after another minute of hiking, we stumbled upon a clearing, where we saw what the noise was emanating from. It was a huge elk, standing in the middle of the clearing, just screaming out into the night. We looked at each other, and through the relieved look on Brian's face, I could tell he still shared the same uneasiness that I was feeling. We turned to look at the huge elk, still waiting, and decided to let it be. Walked all the way back to the stand. After some back and forth, we decided it would be in our best interests to call it a night and just go home. When we hunted at night, Brian usually stayed in the guest room in my cabin, as it was usually late when we got done, 2 or 3 in the morning, and he didn't want to wake his children or wife by coming home. So he crashed at my place. However, even though we were far away now from the elk, it seemed as though it had followed us, and was just as loud as ever. This freaked us both out a little bit, but we figured if we went to sleep, it would all be over in the morning. So we did. But it wasn't the ending. When we woke up, the scream had stopped. We were relieved, and Brian said his goodbye and left for his home. I did my normal routine, went into town, and waited until dusk before going back out into the woods and into my stand. I was still a tad bit unnerved from last night, but I figured this would help me get my mind off of it. And it did. Until around midnight, when I heard a scream again. This time, however, the scream really sounded wrong. Like, really wrong. I could tell this was not the same scream from last night, but it again was not an animal I could put my finger on. I hoped and prayed it would go away.
but it didn't. The screaming persisted and persisted until I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what the hell was screaming in the dead of night. I set out in the same direction as last night, expecting for the worst to be awaiting me. I trudged and trudged through the underbrush, until finally I reached the clearing from the night prior, where the scream had reached its peak. What I saw, however, shook me to my core. There was no elk this time, like I had expected. No. There was a figure standing in the middle of the clearing, facing away from me. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. This thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and I couldn't tell if it was human or something else. I'll admit it, I was terrified. I had never seen anything like this before, and I was ready to book it away from there. I didn't want whatever this thing was to see me though, so I backpedaled, as slow as I could, staring at this thing for as long as it was in view. As soon as it was just on the horizon, it stopped screaming. Again I froze. Why did it stop? I wondered. I stood there, in the trees, dumbfounded, staring at this 8-foot-tall creature that had just been wailing in the middle of the woods. I realized now what a fatal mistake I had made by not running home as soon as I saw this thing. As I stood there, this thing turned around, and my body was struck with fear. Though I was at least 300 yards away from this thing, it stared directly at me, and I knew it knew I was there. Its yellow eyes pierced daggers into my heart as it got down on all fours and began wailing once more, starting to gallop towards me. I stood there frozen for another moment before booking it. I knew all the shortcuts to my house, and I took them all, knowing I may not have much time left. I sprinted faster than I have ever sprinted, hearing its echoing cries in the distance, its growing intensity only proving I was going too slow. As the sound grew louder than ever, I saw my house. I fumbled with my keys to get to the one that opened my front door, and as I reached the porch, I found it. I unlocked the door, ran inside, and slammed it shut. The cries were right outside, and I knew whatever this thing was, it was on my porch, searching for a way to get inside. Terrified, I hid in my freezer, where I hoped the smell of meat and ice would help mask my scent to the being. This is where I've been hiding for the last 2 hours. The creature has now found its way inside my house, and I can hear it moving around upstairs, tracking any signs of me. I am in the basement and in the cooler, so hopefully it won't find me in here. I tried texting Brian to get over to my place, but my messages haven't been going through. And given it's free in the morning, I doubt he'd see them anyways. I have no idea if this thing will go away in the morning. But right now, it's my only hope that I have. If it doesn't, then it will find me eventually. And who knows what it will do then. If you're hearing this, please, I'm begging you, please heed my advice. If you hear strange screaming in the middle of the woods at night,
Do not investigate. I was a night owl. Always had been. My most productive hours fell when the world was silent and shrouded in darkness. It was during these hours that I wrote my stories, played my video games, and most importantly, made my living. I worked for Uber Eats in Los Angeles, a job that suited my nocturnal lifestyle perfectly. This story begins on a humid summer night. I had just finished delivering a late-night pizza to a college kid studying for his exams. As I drove back to the more bustling part of town, I noticed a new order popping up on my phone. It was an address I didn't recognize, nestled in an older, less traveled part of the city. It was a place few people ventured after dark. But an order was an order, and I accepted it. The order was simple. A single cheeseburger from a fast food joint. As I picked up the order, the server gave me a peculiar look. "That's a long way to go for a burger," she said, looking at the delivery address on her screen. I shrugged it off, attributing her concern to the lateness of the hour and the remote location of the delivery address. I thanked her and headed out, the aroma of the freshly cooked burger filling my car. The journey to the address was eerie. The further I went, the less familiar the surroundings became. The vibrant, crowded streets of LA gave way to narrower, desolate roads, shrouded in shadows and an oppressive silence. The city's soundscape faded into a background hum, replaced by the haunting whispers of wind through the skeletal trees lining the road. As I turned onto the street indicated by my GPS, a chilling sense of unease crept over me. The houses here were old and decrepit, their boarded-up windows and overgrown lawns indicative of a long-abandoned neighborhood. It was as if I had stepped into a ghost town within the heart of the metropolis. My headlights landed on the house matching the delivery address. It was a dilapidated two-story building, the chipped paint and crumbling facade adding to its eerie appearance. But what unsettled me most was its windows. They were not boarded up like the others, instead covered by old, faded curtains that seemed to shift ever so slightly. A sensible person would have turned back, but the reality of my financial situation compelled me to carry out the task. I got out of my car, the cheeseburger in hand, and approached the house. The overgrown weeds crunched under my shoes, the sound unnaturally loud in the unsettling silence. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the hollowed-out house. As I waited for a response, a chill ran down my spine. There was something profoundly wrong about this place, an ominous aura that I couldn't shake. And then, the unthinkable happened. The door creaked open on its own, revealing an enveloping darkness within. "Hello?" I called out, my voice tremulous, swallowed up by the darkness inside. An unsettling stillness hung in the air, broken only by the distant echo of my own words. I was just about to turn around, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there, when a voice drifted out from within the house. "Just leave it by the door. Thank you." The voice was old and raspy,
an underlying tone of weakness evident in its timbre. Sympathy momentarily dampened my fear, as I realized this could be an elderly person unable to cook for themselves. I put the bag down near the entrance, took a picture to confirm delivery, and hurried back to my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house. The front door was still open, the burger untouched. The following night, a new order buzzed on my phone. My blood ran cold as I saw the same address from last night. It was the same order, a single cheeseburger. With a deep sigh, I accepted the order. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about. An elderly person, in need, was depending on me. As I turned onto the same abandoned street, my hands were shaking slightly. The sight of the house, bathed in the cold glow of my headlights, did nothing to ease my anxiety. Gathering my courage, I approached the house and left the cheeseburger by the front door. This time, no voice acknowledged me, and the door remained closed. Days turned into a week, and every night, the order from the old house came in like clockwork. Each time, I left a cheeseburger by the front door, and each time, there was no response. My initial fear turned into an uncomfortable routine, the mystery of the old house and its unseen occupant never leaving my thoughts. On the 8th night, things changed. The voice, frail and weak, called out again as I set down the cheeseburger. Could you come in and place it on the table? I'm not feeling well." Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped into the house. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of decay and damp wood. I strained my eyes to adjust to the darkness, flicking on the flashlight on my phone. The narrow beam cut through the shadows, illuminating a pathway strewn with old, tattered furniture and cobwebs. I placed the burger on a rickety table and backed out, not daring to explore further. As I drove away, the feeling of unease was stronger than ever. The image of the decaying interior imprinted on my mind. The house was not fit for habitation, yet someone was living there, surviving off a single cheeseburger every night. But who were they? And why did they choose to live this way? And, most importantly, why did I feel an uncanny sense of dread every time I stepped foot on that property? As the nights wore on, I realized I was about to discover answers that I may not be prepared for. My nights became plagued by nightmares, the old house taking on monstrous proportions in my sleep-addled mind. I would be back in the decaying living room, the weak voice whispering unseen, leading me deeper into the bowels of the house. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of the whisper still resonating in my ears. And still, the orders kept coming. I started to dread the pings on my phone as night fell, knowing that inevitably, one of them would lead me back to the old house. Each visit felt like I was intruding into a story that I wasn't meant to be a part of. An uninvited character in a slowly unfurling horror tale. On the 12th night, my worst fears came to pass. As I laid the cheeseburger at the front door, the voice drifted out, sounding weaker than ever. Can you, please, bring it to me? I hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at me to refuse. But the pleading tone in the voice tugged at my humanity. Swallowing hard, I stepped into the dimly lit interior. The house seemed to groan around me as I walked deeper, following the voice that was now a barely audible whisper. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved past rotting furniture, the beam of my phone's flashlight bouncing off peeling wallpaper and bare wooden floors. Finally, I reached a dilapidated door at the end of a long, narrow hallway. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. Inside was a figure, huddled under threadbare blankets on an old bed, the room reeking of decay and neglect. Over here. The figure lifted a frail hand, gesturing to a bedside table. I placed the burger there, my eyes never leaving the shadowy form under the blankets. As I turned to leave, the voice stopped me. Thank you. Something in the tone, a mix of relief and sorrow, rooted me to the spot. I found myself asking the question that had been gnawing at me for days. Who are you? There was a pause, the silence stretching on until it felt unbearable. Then, the figure under the blanket stirred. Just an old man, waiting to be forgotten. I left the house that night with a heavy heart, the sadness in the old man's voice haunting me. As I continued to deliver the cheeseburgers, night after night, I began to feel a sense of duty, a need to ensure that this lonely soul was not forgotten. But with each visit, the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive, the sense of dread escalating into tangible fear. I started to hear things, whispers in the silence, sighs in the creaking wood, laughter in the rustling wind. The house was alive, its malignant energy growing stronger with each passing night. Until one night, the cheeseburger order didn't come in. Nor the next night, nor the night after that. I found myself driving past the house anyway, a sick feeling of worry gnawing at me. On the fourth day, I summoned the courage to enter the house. The silence inside was deafening, the usual whispering voice absent. I moved towards the room, my heart pounding. As I pushed open the door, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The bed was empty, the room colder than ever. But what truly terrified me was the state of the room. It looked untouched, unused for years. No sign that the frail, dying man had ever been there. In my heart, I knew I'd been delivering meals to a ghost, a lingering spirit tied to the old house, and I was part of his unfinished story. Fear took a back seat to an overwhelming sadness as I realized the truth. The urban legend of the old haunted house wasn't just a legend after all. And the ghost, the lonely old man, was finally at rest. As I left the house for the final time, I could swear I heard a whisper on the wind, an ethereal voice saying, "Thank you." The haunted Uber Eats house remained as a chilling reminder of my encounter with the supernatural, a tale that would haunt my dreams for a long time to come. From what I'd gathered, it was supposed to be a quick and simple thing. The researchers told me I would take a pill, drink some water, and sit in a room for 10 minutes. Afterwards, I would receive a payment of $5,000. Whilst that sounded too good to be true, I desperately needed the cash if I didn't want to end up homeless. Before I was given the pill, they made me sign a document. Standard stuff, I reckoned. I was, after all, taking a highly experimental drug. My eyes skimmed over the content. It was a little bit odd. Most of the clauses weren't aimed at my physical health, but rather at my mental health. I would be lying if I said that didn't freak me out. But, at the end, it also certified that I would be paid $5,000. I signed the paper. They left me entirely alone in a white room, with a bright light hanging in the center of the ceiling. The room was neither large nor tiny, but decently spacious. In the upper corners of the room were cameras, all pointed towards me. I sat in the middle of the room on a metallic chair that I found rather uncomfortable, with a table in front of me. On the table were a couple of things. There were some books the researchers had supplied me with, in case I got bored. But I had my phone, and I reckoned that would do. There was a glass of water and a pill. The pill laid above a napkin, which struck me as far too expensive. The pill was an ominous black, cold to the touch, and quite heavy. It felt like there was a liquid sloshed inside. Deciding to make it as easy for myself as possible, I threw the pill into my mouth before I had time to build up anxiety. I grabbed the glass of water and gulped it down. I felt a tingling sensation coming from my chest, but I waved it off as a mix of parabola and anxiety. Now, if I'd understood it right, all I had to do was sit still for 10 minutes, and then I'd walk out $5,000 richer. This was positively theft, but I hadn't done anything wrong, and the scientists got to blame themselves for their stupidity. After a minute of mindlessly scrolling on Reddit, my heartbeat became audible. Thump, thump, thump. The sound had never been so clear before, and I took a moment just to listen to it. As I focused, I realized that my heart was becoming slower. Not just the tiny bit slower calm or focus could achieve, but almost as if it was beating at half the speed. Moving my hand, I realized that it too moved at a slower speed. Whoa, this is so cool. I wagered the drug could be a great study tool as I picked up one of the books and flipped over to page 1. The sound of my heart beating was still loud, but it had faded out to the background like white noise. Despite already going at a much slower speed, it still seemed to lessen. I wondered when it would stop. 30 pages of reading later, I realized that the experiment was probably over. The book had really drawn me in, and it had made me lose track of time. I grabbed my phone, which was an act that took a lot more conscious effort than I thought it would, and checked the time. There was still 8 minutes left. Wow, this slow motion is really strong, huh? I tried to get back into the book, but my mind had simply decided that 30 pages was enough. Without much in the room to turn my attention to, I opened my phone and started a YouTube video, which really gave me perspective over how slowly time was passing. I could barely make out words, as they were simply being stretched out too far. I ended up closing the video. The person took forever to simply say a single word. I checked the time. Still 8 minutes left. Honestly, I was starting to regret taking this drug. It was a pretty boring experience, but I guessed this was the peak of it. It was obvious to me that time couldn't get much slower. Thump. The sound, slow and stretched and booming, shocked me. My pupils jerked around, trying to spot the source of the sound, but there was nothing in the room. Dread slowly filled me as I pieced together that the source of the sound was my heart. So much time for such a quick action. I wanted the drug to be over at that point. I tried to push the fright down and focus on reading the book, but simply flipping a page took what felt like many minutes. The sense of boredom kept building up, going past anything I'd ever experienced before. I tried to fidget or move, but even though I could barely feel the sensation of trying to move, it was like my body wasn't listening. It was clear to me that my mind was moving far too fast for my body to keep up. I decided the best thing to do was to focus on my thoughts and memories and try to entertain myself that way. To make the visualization easier, I closed my eyes, which took me a full minute. I began by going over my childhood, replaying the memories that meant the most to me. The few precious moments I'd had with my mother before she passed away. The fear at seeing my father angry at me for the first time. Kissing my crush for the first time. It filled me with so many emotions. But eventually, it became boring and exhausting. Deciding to get back to reading the book, I tried to open my eyes. They weren't opening. I strained them as much as I could, but my vision remained black. My eyelids weren't listening to me. Or they were, but the movement was simply too slow for me to notice. When I thought about it, I realized that I hadn't heard my heartbeat in what felt like forever. The whole time I'd gone over my memories, my heart hadn't beat a single time. I hadn't taken a breath in that time either. It was simply me, my thoughts, and darkness. I broke down. I sobbed, but no noise came out. It was all contained in my head, and a deep sinking hole in my chest. I tried to lash out, to scream, but my mouth wouldn't move, and my tongue wouldn't budge. I wanted all of this to stop. I was finished, but there was absolutely nothing I could do but wait. For how long? Maybe I could take a nap. Maybe I could fall asleep. And when I woke, this would all be over. That became my plan. But before I could do so, I needed to calm down first. The more I thought about my situation, the more stressful I became. So I tried to put my mind off of it and focus on something more pleasant. I did it. I fell asleep despite the uncomfortable sitting position and crazy situation. But I awoke to the same darkness. That meant hours had passed to me, and the drug was still impacting me. How long would this go on? A week passed. What had been an uncomfortable situation turned into my worst nightmare. I didn't want any of this anymore. Honestly, I wanted to die, for all of this to be over. But I had no capability to do so. Maybe I already am dead. Once I'd gotten the thought, it wouldn't go away. I hadn't heard my own heartbeat in what must have been days. Neither that nor my breath. I was sure of it now. I had died. The drug must have induced a fatal reaction. This was death. I was stuck here for the rest of eternity. This was everything. A year passed. Or, I think a year. But perhaps it was 10 years. During my time, my mind was so starved for attention that it felt like it began eating itself for something to do. I would hear voices speaking to me, screams, horrible and horrifying, see eyes staring at me within the darkness. I'd stopped thinking of myself as me. Any conception of myself had disappeared, and instead there was simply process, and then there was an observer. Then it all stopped. My heart started beating again, and I was breathing, and my eyes opened, and I was sitting in that damned room that I had entered so long ago. It all felt so unreal to me. I had been so sure of my own death. I screamed and screeched, and a century's worth of agony poured out of me. My fingers ripped into my skin, drawing crimson. I bashed my head against the table and moved to get out and away from the room. I remember that the researchers restrained me, and that I was sent to a psych ward. It took me years before I regained my sanity, and even then, I wasn't myself. I find that if it's silent for too long, I have a panic attack. I'd taken legal action and won a meaningless sum of money. They had shown the recording of what happened on that day. I took the pill, and 2 minutes after doing so, I stood up, screaming and ripping my own skin. I almost couldn't comprehend the video. Within those 2 minutes, there had been an eternity. And to this day, I am terrified of what is coming. Even though I know that I can never truly know what happens after death. My mind and I truly believe that death will bring that same eternal darkness, and that there is nothing I can do to stop it. I am powerless and condemned to an eternity of torture. I've always described my husband, Derek, as a bit of an introvert, but that's not entirely correct. He's gregarious, funny, and charming, but you really have to break past an initial layer of shyness to get to the real him. I laugh because if we hadn't started talking through text first, I doubt I would have discovered that part of him. He really brought his whole self to our date, and it was history after that. He's had his core group of friends for a while, but after we moved out of state for work, he has definitely struggled. I always made friends pretty easily, and love meeting new people. He was fine for a time, coming to events and hanging out with my friends. But after a year or so, he said he started to miss having a regular friend group of his own. His other friends would visit, but they were far, and I sympathized. I encouraged him to get out there in some hobby groups of his, and to be fair, he really did, but nothing resulted in anything long-term outside the days the groups met up. Oh, didn't you say he always wanted to learn how to DJ? My friend Cindy exclaimed. She was one of the 3 women I met up with regularly for book club. Yeah, I think he makes really good playlists, but I think that obsession comes from what he thinks was a missed opportunity. What's stopping him now? Sarah asked, as she sat back and brought her wine glass to her lips. Mostly money. We're just in catch-up mode from school right now, so not a lot of extra spending cash. I thought so, but that's why I asked, Cindy said. Because I know of a club that meets up every Friday night, brings their equipment and practices. My sister went once, but said it wasn't her scene. Knowing her, she probably took a little longer than she preferred to catch on. But since most of the equipment is provided, that's a major barrier gone. I was pretty excited at the news, but that paled in comparison to the glee on his face. His first night out, he couldn't stop talking about the group, how talented everyone was, and that the whole mood of the room changed when he got the chance to practice with one of his playlists. Honestly, they were welcoming but a bit distant when I first came, but I think I really won them over. They even meet once a month for dinner. One of the guys said a lot of people usually disappear after the first month, but they hoped I would come back and become a regular member. For the next couple of the weeks, things were great. I saw a shift in his mood for the better, and he carried himself with much more confidence. I went ahead and told him we could forego our usual date night, so he could go for the first dinner with his new friends. I think he went through multiple outfits that night, before I just grabbed a button-up off the floor. Selfishly, it was my favorite of his. Don't stress over clothes. They obviously like you for you, and your taste in music. Besides, if it was about your clothes, they would have kicked you out a long time ago. I chuckled and gave him a kiss. You just don't understand the geek chic look I'm going for. Not everyone understands fashion. It's okay. Derek smirked, returned a kiss, and then headed out. He checked in later in the night to let me know they had talked him into going to a small venue where other musicians, DJs, and professionals frequented. I wasn't familiar, but I recognized I didn't know much about the underground music scene here. Derek returned at 2 a.m., a bit disheveled, but had clearly had fun. A couple of his friends had driven him home and helped him up to our door. A striking couple. The man introduced himself as Jamie, and a woman, who I assumed to be his girlfriend, said she was Natalie. She wrapped herself around Jamie's arm as soon as they got Derek to the door and apologized for letting him have a bit too much fun. I told them it was more than fine and reached out to help him inside. Before he crossed our entryway, Jamie grabbed his arm and dropped the keys into his hand.
"Don't want to forget these. We carpooled and your car should still be at the restaurant. I thought it would be less of a hassle, since it's closer to you guys than whatever club we ended up at."
I thanked them. I could smell the faint scent of alcohol as I helped Derek inside. We headed toward our bedroom, and he recounted the parts of the night he could remember. I noticed as he talked that he kept massaging between his neck and right shoulder. I asked him to let me see, and gasped. "Jesus! What happened, Derek? This is horribly bruised. If someone tried to give you a hickey, they did an awful job." There was even specks of blood on his collar. Derek looked at me confused. He honestly had no idea anything was even there, and thought it was just sore from a drunken accident.
"The place was pretty rowdy, and I do vaguely remember a sharp pain and my vision spinning. Before I knew what happened, Natalie had sat me down on one of the couches. People were pretty riled up and tried to get me to celebrate someone's birthday or something, but Jamie got them to leave me alone while I got it together."
I was relieved he was okay, but didn't feel great that he was hurt for God knows what reason, and decided to leave it alone so we could get some sleep. The next few days were definitely odd, to say the least. On the first day after his night out, Derek could barely keep his eyes open and kept complaining about how bright everything was. He was usually an all blinds fully open as much as possible kind of guy, much to my chagrin. I thought it was also odd, because it wasn't particularly bright out that morning, but I passed it off as a hangover. The second day he had trouble staying awake during the day. Derek was never a morning person, and always a bit of a night owl, but this sluggishness seemed extreme. He was fully awake by the evening throughout the early morning. Since we weren't sure what was going on yet, he was able to get accommodations to work his new odd hours. Since he worked from home, it wasn't too much trouble. It would have to do until our doctor could come back with anything useful. On the third night, we were out on a date, but he didn't eat very much. He said he was fine with a couple drinks and an appetizer he barely ate any of. On the fourth night, his normal chestnut skin had become washed and dulled of color. Even his usually bright brown eyes had lost some of their luster, but were simultaneously sharper, more focused. It was like he watched where you were headed instead of where you currently were. On the fifth night, Derek had accidentally broke every glass he held while doing dishes, and on the sixth, he started to complain about how dry his throat was. No matter how much he drank and tried to eat, he said he didn't feel satisfied. It was on the seventh night that his friends showed up to pick him up for another jam session. They had never done this before, and I wasn't too keen on him going, since we still had no idea what was going on. But it also seemed like a night out would do him some good. Honestly, I also felt like I needed a break to decompress and think of what else we could do to find out what was happening. I fell asleep faster than I intended, and was startled awake by an urgent tapping at our door. I went downstairs and saw Derek through the peephole, and opened it. I covered my mouth in horror. Blood stained Derek's shirt, and as my mind came back, I saw it was on his face as well. He braced himself on the doorframe and said,
"Hey, can I come in?"
I don't know what it was, but despite my love for this man, something visceral in my body kept my mouth shut. I just stared for a few moments and slowly closed the door. He knocked again.
"Please, Trish, let me in. I just want to talk. Look, I know this sounds weird, but if you come to the club with me, you can find out what's going on with me. They said they'd make an exception for you and let you inside."
I had no idea what he was talking about. I barely heard what he said over the voice in my head, screaming for me to keep him outside. I sat on the ground and stared ahead as he kept knocking and trying to convince me to go with him. I finally found it in me to creep back upstairs. I thought I was quiet and didn't make a sound, but he raised his voice for me to not go. I'm sitting in our room now, and I'm absolutely terrified. I don't know what to do. I drew our blinds closed, because not long after being up here, I heard a soft, firm tapping on our bedroom window. I turned and saw Derek, effortlessly hanging from the outside wall. His eyes no longer pleading, but sharp and hungry. I couldn't think while those eyes dissected me. I don't know what to do. The voice in my head telling me to keep him outside is getting quieter, while his voice is ever more prominent.
"Trish, love, tell me I can come in. Let me in, Trish. Let me in."
It was when I started my new job in London. I won't say what it is, but it is a very well-paying job I may not be qualified for. Still, if you know what rent is like in the better part of London, you'd know you'll need a wealthy income. My first day there was like any other job. I was touring through my department when I glanced at a large bloke who looked at me oddly. Not how you would look at a new co-worker, but more like how you would look at your bosses when they come in and find out you haven't been working. I would describe it as confused, yet panicked. Later, I was introduced to him. His name was Bradley, and he was my superior. I still remember how he approached me, like one would a grizzly bear. He stammered. "No.
Do I?"
He stared at my face, registered every detail.
"No. I don't know you. Do I?"
To break the ice on the odd interaction, I said, "No, we haven't met." I told him my name.
"We haven't, have we? Sorry."
He shook my hand.
"My name is Bradley. Just call me Brad."
Wow. Sorry. Do you have a twin or something?"
Sorry, no, you just look like someone I know. One of my neighbors, I think. I looked quizzically at him. Well, I don't have a twin, and I don't know you. Shall we? Oh, right. Let me show you the ropes. Sorry, you just look so similar. He must be your look-alike or something. Sorry, you look nice. I smiled at him. We became good friends over the next few months. Brad was very upbeat and friendly, and occasionally quite weird, in a good way. He knew how to have a good time, drink like an Irishman with his mates from work in the pub, and support his favourite football team, Arsenal. Brad was the average middle-aged Brit. He looked like it too. As I said before, he was a big bastard. He had a growing potbelly and a round jolly face. I wouldn't call him as good-looking as Sylvester Stallone, but he was handsome for his age. Yet it was clear a large part of Brad's life was a mystery. According to my co-workers, he was single, and no one had ever been around to his place. Despite his reclusiveness, I was the closest person to him, and we were a lot more than just friends. I still didn't know much more about him than anyone else, particularly when I knew he knew more about my so-called doppelganger than he let on. My primary reason for suspecting him was how he got my name wrong on several occasions. He blushed the hardest the first time he did it, when he called me Sonny. I recoiled from him slightly. What did you just call me? He blinked a couple of times and corrected himself while apologizing. Is that the name of my look-alike? I asked him. He looked off into the distant corner of the pub as he replied. Yeah, sorry, you just look so much like him. I met his eyes head-on and suggested, do you think I could meet him sometime? It was the first time we argued. It wasn't a big row, just enough to put a few days between us. Whenever Brad called me Sonny after that, I just ignored it. For whatever reason, Brad didn't want to talk about my look-alike. I found this strange since that drew him to me in the first place. It was obvious my replicant was more to him than a neighbour. I considered whether he was having a secret affair with Sonny, and after he met me, Brad wanted to play the field. I didn't think Sonny was being had on the side. It didn't explain why he was so secretive about his relationship with Sonny. I just assumed he was yet to come out of his closet, as neither of us had made anything official between us, after all. Time and time again, Brad refused to let me come and see his home. It was like he had something to hide, and this had made me curious. So, one evening after work, I followed Brad home. Not in a stalker way, but more in a concerned co-worker way. Besides, he knew he was the kind of person to take the gesture lightly. Brad's place was an upper-class house that must have been worth $500,000. It was more than what I could rent, but Brad had it passed down to him from his family, who he often bragged were quite well off. It was such a nice house. It made me wonder even more about his private life. If he wanted, he could host high-class dinner parties with his friends. Why would he keep the place to himself? It wasn't like him. He entered his lavish home, closing the door behind him. I walked up and considered knocking. I hesitated to let him know I was there, and reconsidered my actions. Maybe stalking him home may have been a bit much, as he clearly didn't want any work friends to see his place. But I had made it that far, so I thought, what the hell? I knew he was the forgiving type, and we were definitely more than just work friends. I pressed my knuckle against his door, but before I could knock, the door shifted forward. Pushing on the door lightly, it opened. With this revelation, I thought about sneaking up on Brad to teach him to lock his door properly. Once again, I thought, I've made it this far, I might as well. Then, as I crept along the entrance hall to explore further, I heard something from a door opposite me. I first thought it was the house creaking under its weight, though as my mind processed the subtle noise, it sounded more like a rattle. Some people might judge me for nosing around another person's home without their permission. I can't help it. I'm the prying sort of person, and I'm glad I did. I put my ear to the door to listen for the sound, and after a few moments, there it was again. A metallic rattle in an echoey room. I waited for it again. The next time, it sounded like a soft metallic scrape, like something was briefly dragged along a concrete floor. And this time, I knew what the sound was of. It was undeniably a metal chain. Does he have something chained up in here? I twisted the old doorknob, pushing the door open. Behind it were stairs descending into a dark space. This filled me with a new dread. What the hell does Brad have locked up down there? I pondered. It was one thing to have something chained up in your house. It was another to have something chained up in your basement, kept from public view. And it was then I realized I just stumbled onto Brad's secret. Before deciding whether to retreat or go down, I sensed Brad coming to close his front door. Swiftly, and as quietly as I could, I stepped down and pushed the door closed. The only light source came from the sunlight from around the door. Luckily, this was enough to see the light switch next to me. With nowhere else to go, I flicked on the switch and ventured down. The basement light slowly flickered on, like I'd imagined the lights in a bunker during the First World War would turn on. The scene before me couldn't look any more wrong. On the floor in the corner, a man lay naked and covered in filth. I couldn't see his face. He was curled up in a ball facing away, but he slowly became animated as I trudged down to his level. His body uncrumpled slightly, jingling the chain around his ankle, as the man's eyes gazed up at me with discontent through long matted hair. But within the same instant, his eyes turned to that of the dreary dead, and with a little more speed than before, he stood up. I got face to face to have my first good look at him. He looked almost exactly like me. He was my look-alike. I instantly knew what Brad meant before. If I hadn't seen him stand up, I would have assumed I was gazing into a mirror, or at least a distorted mirror. His features, though almost exactly like mine, were ever so slightly off. Only slightly. It took me a few seconds to see the differences. And before people say he is related to me, I can assure you that the man I had seen in that basement had no relation to me whatsoever. It was pure coincidence. We investigated each other's faces for quite some time, almost mirroring each other to make the differences more apparent. It was a truly bizarre and unique experience, meeting my doppelganger, especially given the circumstances. But as fast as the amazement suddenly came, the sudden realization of the situation came faster. Bradley is keeping my doppelganger chained up in his fucking basement. At the time, I was in denial of that conclusion. Even as clear as the evidence was, the feeling of not truly knowing your best friend's true nature is a feeling that can't be described. My mind tried rationalizing the situation and giving my friend a moral explanation for keeping this man in his basement. Or better, maybe the man was locked up in Bradley's basement without his knowledge. However, no logical explanation made itself known. I think our hearts skipped a beat when we heard the door above us creak open and Bradley's thunderous footsteps marching down the stairs. I had to hide. The chained-up man also knew this and quickly pointed to the broom cupboard under the stairs, whispering, "In there." I hid and peeked through the door slit. Through it, I saw Bradley come down and approach the man in the corner. "Sonny," he yapped. "How's my boy?" I couldn't see what he was doing to Sonny. I could only see Bradley's back. But from the context of what he was saying, I assumed he was stroking Sonny. "Yes, you're still okay." That freaked me out. He said the exact same thing when we flirted. Bradley continued. "Now, how about you explain the light being on? I know I turned it off when I left you." He leaned down, and I could see Sonny looking helplessly at me. "Looks like you haven't escaped your chains." Bradley slowly stood up again and whispered something into Sonny's ear. I don't know what he said, but the horrified look on Sonny's face told me enough. Just as slowly, he turned his head to look directly at me. He knows where I am. Bradley moved towards me, and Sonny grabbed his leg, holding it with all his might. I knew what I had to do at that moment. It was do or die. I leapt from my position and scrambled for the stairs. I fled on all fours like a hound out of hell. I swung the door open and sprinted out, with Bradley wailing at me to come back. I ran down the street like a madman. I kept running, and I didn't stop until I knew without a doubt Bradley wouldn't catch up to me. Eventually, I came across a pedestrian. "You alright, mate?" he asked. There was only one response I had to give. "Call the police." Later, the police arrived at Bradley's house and found it empty. After questioning the neighbors, they found out he left in his car not too long after I ran out, and he was carrying what apparently looked like a body wrapped in bin bags. The police tracked him down and found him burning something by the Thames. It was Sonny's body. Bradley was arrested and later questioned. He admitted to kidnapping Sonny, but not to abusing him or murdering him. So, who was Sonny? Sonny was never his real name, just the name Bradley gave him. He disappeared around a decade ago from a local park as a kid. No one suspected Bradley of kidnapping him. I wish I tried to save him. He died because I ran. I don't even know what to say. I would have never thought Bradley was capable of such horrible things. And I now have to live with the fact my friend was a kidnapping murderer. Yet, it gets worse. After the detective I spoke to told me the rest of the story, he also informed me that Bradley was trying to send me what looked like love letters. I could only unmask Bradley because I happened to look like his chained-up victim. So, if there is a lesson in my story, then make it this. Know who your friends are. Because for all you know, they might be just like Bradley.
Hello, Sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.